Welcome everybody to the summer edition of the Exeter Center for the Study of the Life Sciences seminar series. We are extremely happy and honored today to be starting our seminar series for the term with an illustrious guest and an incredibly interesting discussion. And this is by hosting Professor John Krieger, who is Kranzberg Professor Emeritus for the Georgia Institute of Technology since 2000. He's been working in many different institutions, being a visiting scholar across the US and Europe. And John really is one of the towering figures in the history of science and technology, and his contributions are numerous, and I'm sure you're very well aware of them. I'm not even going to try and summarize the breadth and the depth of the work that John has brought to the history of technology. He started his career by conducting large projects which basically produced the definitive histories of CERN and of the European Space Agency. And then he spent several years doing, again, definitive work on the relationship between the US and the European Union and European states during the Cold War, collaborating with some of the other top names in the history of the field. And then he's been spending the last few years focusing more and more on questions around nation building and the role of science and technology within them, and building up a whole strand, a whole approach to the history of science and technology, which is a strand of that focuses on transnationalism and the movement of knowledge across nations. He has received the Francis Bacon Award in 2019, which is the highest accolade for an historian of science and technology. And one of his latest volumes is this, which is called How Knowledge Moves. And I think this is of particular value to people who follow or are members of Egenis. This focuses on the transnational history of science and technology, and it's an absolutely fundamental volume for anybody who is interested in the movement of knowledge at the global level, and in specifically on the difficulties and the challenges and the questions that emerge as knowledge and artifacts relating to this cross borders, or do not, in fact, as much of his work is documented. So without further ado, thank you very much, John, for being with us, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for sharing your time with me rather than with the sun. I hope you find it worthwhile, and thanks for a very generous introduction. Sabina, I met Sabina at the Bacon Conference. She's a fantastic colleague and a wonderful person to work with. I wish I could join you in Exeter, but it's not going to happen. I'll just share my screen now, and I hope this works. Okay, is that clear? Can everybody see that?
That's perfect. Thank you, John.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of my recent work, which is on, and I particularly want to draw your attention to a particular kind of knowledge transfer that is generally not concerned and studied, but which I think I think is really terribly important for us all to be aware of. So here I go. On the 2nd of January this last year, Charles Lieber, the chair of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard, was led into a federal court in Boston in a yellow jumpsuit with handcuffs around his neck, his wrists. Lieber was charged by the American Department of Justice with making a materially false, fictitious, and fraudulent statement regarding his involvement in Beijing's most prestigious program to recruit outstanding foreign researchers to work temporarily in China, the so-called 1,000 Talents program. He was remanded in federal custody and released 2 days later on a bail of $1 million in cash. The university placed him on paid administrative leave, barred him from the campus, and suspended his research and teaching roles. On June the 9th, 2020, so 6 months later, he was indicted by a federal grand jury on one count of lying to the federal authorities about his participation in this Chinese talent program, and on one count of also lying to Harvard about it. On July 28th, he was further indicted for failing to report the money that he'd earned on his tax forms for the federal government. Lieber has not yet been convicted, but if he is, he may actually face imprisonment for a term of more than 10 years and over $500,000 in fines. This case is historic for 3 reasons. Firstly, Lieber's prestige. He was one of about 30 so-called Harvard professors, faculty of particular distinction who have told me they're the most highly paid faculty in the world. So money matters here. His CV lists over 24 prestigious awards, and he's a member of 10 professional associations, including exceptionally the National Academy of Sciences, of Medicine, and of Engineering. He has over 400 publications to his name, and he's been nominated several times for the Nobel Prize for his work on nanotechnology and its application. The second case is important. The second reason this is important is because of the financial dimension. Lieber had been given a grant of about more than $15 million from the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health over the last decade. At the same time, beginning in 2011, he'd received generous financial support from the Chinese authorities. Amongst other activities, he signed a contract with the Wuhan University of Technology, which is there, and it's the Wuhan, by the way, which is the site of COVID, we believe, in the framework of China's 1,000 Talents program. Lieber was paid $50,000 a month to be in Wuhan and giving living expenses of up to about $160,000 spread over 3 years. He also was paid to set up a mirror research lab in Wuhan and given $1.5 million to do that. The third reason, and that's the one that really matters to me, is because of the kind of knowledge that Lieber was sharing with his Chinese colleagues and students. He was supposed to set up what was called a WUT, Harvard Joint Nano Key Laboratory. He was to train students in advanced research and development of nanowire-based lithium-ion batteries with high performance for electric vehicles. So he's building batteries for electric vehicles, electric cars. Lieber has also developed nanotechnology devices for medical use. He has over 50 patents to his name and has set up 2 companies to commercialize his work, NanoSys Incorporated in 2001 and a nanosensor company called Vista Therapeutics in 2007. So he's an academic entrepreneur as well as being a brilliant scientist and applied physicist. Lieber's case is still pending. In the interim, just a few weeks ago, over 40 Harvard academics signed an open letter deploring what they called a tragically misguided government campaign that is discouraging American scientists from collaborating with peers in other countries, particularly China. They pointed out that most of Lieber's misdemeanors should have been handled by the university itself and treated as internal matters and not criminalized by the government. In supporting Lieber, they said, they were standing up for his outstanding scientific record and I quote, the fundamental concepts of scholarly collaboration, academic freedom, and scientific advancement. The Harvard faculty in this letter did not reference the content of Lieber's work. For them, international scientific collaboration in basic science is an unassailable value and essential to the advancement of American science itself. This ideology, as you all know, is deeply embedded in the scientific community itself. I just recently read a Japanese astrophysicist, called Kajino, who'd recently been recruited to head a research center in Beijing, put it this way. Scientific, and it's common, it's a typical example, but it's being stressed even now, still today. Scientific activity is international and knows no borders. It is the total opposite of nationalist ideas. Every scientific achievement is the common property of humanity. The Trump administration doesn't think so. In fact, in October 2020, the White House released a list of 20 critically emerging technologies that had to be protected in the name of national security. It included energy technologies, like that, for new batteries, and medical and public health technologies, such as also Lieber develops. Precisely the kind of applications that he's engaged in and that he's commercialized himself and that he's teaching other people in China to develop. For the Harvard faculty, Lieber was doing fundamental unclassified research that could be freely shared with anyone, be they in China or in Exeter. For the Trump administration, it could not be freely shared with America's arch economic and political rival because it posed a threat to national security. Of course, the Harvard faculty hope, and the timing is not coincidental, and there's been a similar initiative, by the way, just taken at MIT, that replacing Trump with Biden in the White House would enable traditional scientific internationalism to prevail over what they see as a temporary aberration, in the case of Trump, and an assault on academic freedom. I think they're going to be disappointed. Firstly, because to date, there is no evidence that the new administration will depart sharply from the policies adopted by the predecessor in this domain. In other words, Biden on this issue seems to be following in Trump's footsteps. And why? And that's really the point of my talk. The Trump administration's position on controlling international circulation of knowledge is that knowledge that is not classified. His policy on controlling knowledge that is not classified has a long history and is institutionalized in the executive branch of the government and the research system itself. I'll touch briefly on the political continuity between Biden and Trump on this issue, and then I'll go into depth into the structural historical reasons for it and why the American administration is controlling unclassified free fundamental research in this case. And that's the substance of my talk. On the day after he took office, President Joe Biden confirmed the appointment of Christopher Wray as FBI director. Wray was Trump's FBI director and an extremely confrontational and aggressive attacker of China. Here follows a number of quotes by Wray about what is happening with Chinese-American collaboration in academic life. It was Wray who told a Senate Intelligence Committee that the US national security was endangered by China's use of non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students. We see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country. It's not just in major cities, it's in small ones as well. It's across basically every discipline. It was Wray who deplored the naivete of the academic sector that he said had failed to grasp the extent to which the very open research and development environment that we have, and which we all revere, was being exploited by China, that was targeting our nation's assets, our information and ideas, our innovation, our research and development, our technology. And it was Wray who claimed in April 2019, in a very classic statement, China seems determined to steal its way up the economic ladder at our expense. So one can't expect much from Wray in this post and can't expect much change in policy as long as Biden leaves Wray in that position. It's not the internal politics of the United States that interests me, though. My question is, why is the FBI and Christopher Wray and the Harvard faculty speaking completely past each other? I suggest that, in rhetoric at least, it's because the faculty only distinguish between certain kinds of knowledge which are not at all covering the kind of knowledge that Lieber is using and that the US government is concerned about. So the academic faculty distinguish between three kinds of knowledge. Knowledge that is classified and protected behind high national walls, obviously nuclear physics knowledge about the bomb. Knowledge that is protected by patents, commercialized and protected by patents in the market economy. And thirdly, knowledge which can circulate freely across borders and that expresses the values of scientific internationalism. But the FBI is looking at this matter quite differently, because what these academic distinctions overlook is a gray zone of knowledge that is neither sensitive enough to be classified, nor so remote from national, military, or economic interests as to be freely shared and openly published. This gray zone is seldom, if ever, recognized in the scholarly literature, although it is a part and parcel of the everyday life of the world of corporations who export advanced knowledge-based goods and services, and of universities and American research institutes that train foreign nationals in advanced fields of learning, including Harvard and MIT, and the institution where I used to work, Georgia Tech. It's an absolutely part and parcel of the everyday life of a research scientist or engineer at Georgia Tech, Harvard, or MIT. It is also a transnational category of knowledge whose circulation is regulated by a variety of stakeholders who watch over the political economy of the American-centered system of knowledge production and circulation. So this sensitive but unclassified knowledge is what I want to talk about. At the heart of the system that deals with this knowledge is an epistemologically sophisticated legal regime administered by the national security state, whose history can be traced back to the early Cold War, if not before. So the Trump administration and Christopher Wray did not break with tradition, nor did they invent major new instruments to regulate the circulation of sensitive unclassified knowledge and know-how to China and to Chinese nationals when they charged Liber. They built on and strengthened a structure that was already in place and has been in place for 60, 70 years. So in what follows, I want to describe the contours of this gray zone of knowledge that is neither classified nor can circulate freely, and then trace the historical arc of one major component, export controls, as mobilized by the national security state to regulate its movement across national borders. So first I'm going to describe and tell you a little bit about export controls. Most people in the history of science and technology never even dream of studying export controls, and I advise you not to, because dreams become nightmares. This is a terribly complicated, labyrinthine, intricate, politicized, difficult thing to do. I couldn't have done it without my colleague Mario Daniels, and we produced a book on it which will come out next year with the University of Chicago Press. So after I've spoken to you a bit about export controls and simplified it so that we get the point, I will go on to discuss the two other institutional sites of knowledge control, the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, and MIT. And then I'll just at the end briefly discuss how a transnational approach to the circulation of knowledge can be a useful way of understanding this kind of knowledge circulation and engage with this gray zone. And a gray zone that, as I've said, is largely overlooked in the scholarly literature. I think this transnational approach both encapsulates the role of scientific internationalism, but also evades the epistemological obstacles that it places in our way of understanding the political economy of knowledge production and circulation in an interconnected world. I hope everybody's okay. No negative signals. I suppose you're all muted anyway, so you can't really respond.
Oh, great, John.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, let me talk a little about export controls. The United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed military and economic power on the globe. To secure a preponderance of power in its favor, it quickly moved to maintain a monopoly over the raw materials needed for producing nuclear weapons and to protect the knowledge that went into designing and producing them behind a wall of patents and classification. This is very well known and standard. What is usually ignored is that the Truman administration simultaneously extended a system of export controls put in place during the war and later formalized in the Export Control Act of 1949. In this section, I'll briefly summarize some of the turning points in the history of this act, this regulatory instrument, that is the subject of this big book I'm doing with Mario Daniels. So, the Export Control Act endowed the president with extremely far-reaching powers to protect the domestic health of the economy in peacetime. For example, doing obvious things like curbing the export of scarce materials. But it also authorized the president, and that's why, of course, as an historian of science and technology, I'm interested, to curtail or prohibit the exportation of any articles, materials, or supplies, including technical data, whose acquisition by foreign powers was not compatible with US foreign policy or national security. In other words, that meant was of potential military significance. It meant, in fact, that that Export Control Act was intended to control the circulation of dual-use civil military items that could be therefore of value of potential military significance. Note the word potential. So that civil dual use is potentially of military significance. But what did controls on technical data actually mean? In November 1949, the Department of Commerce proposed to define technical data in this way: information on new technical procedures, know-how, chemical processes, or even technical consultants themselves. Look at the word know-how in here. So what is striking here is that the prime target of regulation is not the nuts and bolts of manufacturing as we might expect, and therefore not be interested in as historians of science and technology, but information on new procedures, intangible know-how, and the tacit knowledge and skills that traveled with technical consultants when they went abroad. Why was that there? I mean, I've just been reading a book about the exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States during the 1930s, and it's got a lot of data about the massive exchanges of technology between these two countries. For example, about 10,000 foreign engineers and technicians worked in Soviet heavy industry from 1929 to 1935. those Soviet engineers, those American, Soviet, or foreign engineers and technicians would carry their skills and their know-how over into heavy industry in the Soviet Union. And it's that kind of transfer of knowledge that this kind of act is targeting now, straight after the end of the Second World War and in the early days of the Cold War. It's just the first step in an expansion of the scope of export controls on forms of knowledge that continues today. 3 more were quickly taken. So here's the first. As originally conceived, this act focused on knowledge exchanges that took place when knowledge or its bearer traveled outside the United States, as when these foreign consultants went over to the Soviet Union and helped them install a replica of the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, for example. An amendment in 1954 stipulated that a company needed an export license as well to share sensitive technical knowledge and know-how with foreign nationals inside the United States itself. So an export was deemed to have occurred on the grounds that the recipient of that knowledge might take the new information and knowledge back to their home countries. And in fact, the Soviets sent no less than 1,000 engineers over to Ford between 1930 and 1933 to work on the shop floor, not in the design room, on the shop floor beside the technicians, the engineers, learning how to build and use and develop a production line for automobiles. But of course, the same production line was later mobilized for building trucks, tractors, and of course, tanks. So this is the dual use move. So now we're not only going to control know-how, which people carry abroad, but also know-how which people gain when they come into the United States. And that's called a deemed export. Although they're still they're not even out of the country, they're on the territory of the United States, but you need a license to actually train them in your plant in the United States. Now, of course, this deemed export rule that you can share knowledge, you may not share knowledge, sensitive, unclassified knowledge with someone in your own country, namely the United States, immediately had impacts on academia, because a lot of advanced students or foreign visitors studied at American universities and were trained as postgraduates in very sophisticated kinds of science and technology. So this act threatened to inject state regulation into international scientific exchange on American campuses. To protect academic freedom, the distinction between basic and applied science was used by the Commerce Department in consultation with American Nobel Prize winners. They said, we need a way to enable foreign nationals to work on our campuses and be trained in advanced science and engineering, and able to go back home without a license being required for them to do that. What should we do? And the basic applied science distinction was excavated and used politically to say, okay, if it's basic science, it can be shared freely. If it has any application, it can be regulated and controlled by the state. So in that way, a distinction between basic and applied science, which you're all familiar with, became a tool, politicized as a tool of regulation to carve open a space in which the performance of scientific internationalism beyond the reach of state regulation was possible, and of course protected by the First Amendment of the American Constitution. That's the free speech. So would you believe it, but when you actually collaborate with an American scholar, it's the First Amendment that is protecting the free circulation of your information with them, and that's legally enshrined in scientific internationalism in the United States. Okay, so of course, basic science is science that you typically openly publish. That's one of your key criteria. So what about unpublished technical data? What happens with that? You can notice now, by the way, that the law imagines and covers every possible situation. So this was tested in 1962 in a landmark decision by the federal court. And it decided that unpublished technical data is the tacit knowledge and experience acquired by technically trained people throughout their professional careers in the United States, and that had not been specifically put in the public domain before. So what you've carried in your head and your hands, but have not yet published and what you've built up over your lifetime, that's unpublished technical data. And that, if that is sensitive, that may not be shared either with a foreign national without a license. The engineers employed by a New York-based company that constructed a petroleum cracking plant in Romania were told that without a license from the Commerce Department, the application of their United States origin know-how and experience constituted an unauthorized use and export of unpublished data to the communist bloc. This firm, by the way, was punished heavily for building a petroleum cracking plant in Romania, in which the engineers from New York, who had also been working in France to do the same thing, went and built this in Romania, but shared unpublished experience, tacit knowledge and skills with their Romanian communist partners, and the firm was blacklisted for 6 years by the United States government. So you can see that knowledge is a very deep concern to the American government, knowledge that affects national security, or seems to affect national security, and anything that touches the Soviet Union at this time in the early Cold War is a national security threat, especially if it's dual use. But there were two further major revisions undertaken to this act that I'll just touch on briefly in the 70s and 80s. Firstly, the goal of controls was no longer simply to deny rivals access to dual use items. In an economic environment of increased international competition and of accelerated technological change, particularly in the manufacture and consumption of information technologies and semiconductors, their goal was now to maintain the technological gap between the US and its allies and enemies, and its allies and its enemies. The person who pushed this major change, it was regarded as the most fundamental change in the export control legislation, was a man called Fred Bussey. His name is not on there, but he was recruited by the Department of Defense to analyze export controls of American technology and to decide what was the most dangerous thing that could be shared with a foreign partner, which would threaten American national security. And what Bussey argued was that to maintain America's scientific and technological lead, to maintain the technological gap with its rivals and with its allies, intangible knowledge should be the target of export controls and not commodities as such. And he defined intangible knowledge in a way that would make Harry Collins happy. He called it the detail of how to do things. And this is, by the way, this is ironic. It's exactly the same time that Harry Collins and others are beginning to talk about tacit knowledge. Fred Bussey, the CEO of Texas Instruments, is telling the American government, one thing you have to control is the circulation of intangible intangible knowledge, tacit knowledge and skills, the detail of how to do things. This is already, of course, in the Export Control Act, as I mentioned a moment ago. But Bussey gave the idea a different spin because he said tacit knowledge and skills were important, not simply to build and to maintain an existing technological system. What it could do was provide those who gained it with a generic skill, which enabled them to develop an existing technology in new, interesting, and unexpected ways. I'll admit him, and I'll go on. So for Bussey, the release of know-how, as he put it, is an irreversible decision. Forget what's in square brackets there. Once released, it can neither be taken back nor controlled. The receiver of know-how gains a competence which can serve as a base for many subsequent gains. And that's really what Bussey is so concerned about. Because once you've shared this knowledge with another country, it's not that they can simply reproduce your production plant or reproduce your chip manufacturing system. They can reproduce that in new and different ways because they have these generic skills which are embedded in know-how and tacit knowledge, and that enables them to overtake you, or at least catch up with you in ways which you can't anticipate because it's novel and unusual and perhaps not something that you've thought about. So he focused in strongly on know-how as something that needs to be controlled. And of course, this has, in the 80s, huge ramifications for academic research and academic international exchange. But I'm not going to go into that in more detail. The second key revision, so now we've really got not just knowledge, but know-how, tacit knowledge and skills. All of these are now very deeply embedded in the export control system, all in the name of national security. The second key change occurs in the United States in the 1980s when the word national security is interrogated and people say, well, is it enough to protect our technology simply because people can benefit from it militarily. The apparatus of the national security state was put in place in the early Cold War to meet the Soviet threat. It was specifically intended to sustain America's military advantage by combining ceaseless scientific and technological innovation at home with a denial of export of technology across a broad front to the Soviet bloc. The meaning it gave to the term national security was subsequently enlarged in the 1980s to embrace economic security. You know, when the United States government puts the word security behind something, it means that the federal government has the right, authority to intervene in protecting that. So now the idea is you can protect the transfer of knowledge if it threatens you economically, not just militarily, but economically. And this is this is at the same time, by the way, that we have the emergence of neoliberalism and market economies and an emphasis on the free markets. And it's a totally hidden detail that even as there was the stress on the importance of the market, right, for managing global interactions, at the same time, there's a strong protectionist push to hold back and to put a wall around sensitive, unclassified knowledge that could threaten America's economic security. The idea that national security should be extended beyond military security emerged in wide-ranging debates among actors in Congress, the administration, and civil society in the late 1980s and early 1990s. What caused this was the rise of Japan as a major economic power that was outcompeting the US in the semiconductor industry and related chip-based industries like computers. They were spurred on by works by Paul Kennedy's famous analysis of the rise and fall of great powers, published in 1987, and that highlighted the importance of national economic strength to have global influence. And let me just fast forward. I mean, that's, of course, the core of the fight between the United States and China under the Trump administration it was less about military competition and much more about economic competition in high technology and the development of measures to protect America's economic security. Here's what this is what two members of the establishment said in spring 1990. International competition has eroded the once commanding American advantage in technology. When it comes to advanced technology, national security can no longer be viewed in purely military terms. Economic security is also a vital consideration. And this is from the cover of Foreign Affairs, by the way, and I think the shadow over these flags is to say that they've died for nothing unless you protect also the country from the threat of economic competition, which will undermine its military strength. The free circulation of knowledge was no longer restricted now only by its potential military significance. Export controls would also be invoked to protect its impact on American economic competitiveness. And here you can already see why Lieber is interesting, right? Because what he's promoting is electric batteries and nanotechnologies in the health area, which are all of immense economic importance to the next generation of technological development in the US. So this is the broad context in which the Trump administration went on the offensive against China. Trump himself specifically identified economic security with national security. Regulating the flow of knowledge and know-how with China in select high-tech sectors was just another dimension of the trade war. His National Security Administration extended existing regulatory systems and added new ones to control the loss of advanced knowledge to China. Its aim was to protect the American high-tech economy from a regime that Ray accused of stealing its way up the economic ladder at American expense. As I mentioned a moment ago, in October 2020, the White House defined a list of 20 critical and emerging technologies that mirrored the fields that the Chinese authorities had defined as central to strengthening their position in global high-tech markets. It explicitly invoked a protectionist policy to secure world leadership for the US and its allies in these fields, one of which was energy and the other medical and public health technologies. And if you go down on the right-hand side of that list, you can see near the bottom about 4 down, energy technologies and medical and public health technologies. You notice the vast range, by the way, of technologies that the government wants to protect. And this whole text, if you want to read it, is all about protecting the flow of these knowledges in these fields And the headline is a statement by Trump: economic security is national security. And this, of course, brings us then to one of Lieber's funding agencies, the National Institutes of Health. And I'm now going to move away from the very formal legal system that is embodied in export controls and related regulations, and show you how other institutions in the United States are walking in step with the United States government to impose these same kinds of constraints with different kinds of sanctions, because they don't exactly have the direct backing of the law, but in different kinds of sanctions on who researchers can collaborate with. The NIH, let me just have a drink of water. It's funny speaking to like this. The NIH invests about $39 billion annually in medical and biological research, and distributes about 80% of that money through 50,000 grants to more than 300,000 grantees, or PIs, in the US and around the world. So that's $39 billion, a lot of money. In August 2018, its director, Francis Collins, sent letters to over 10,000 senior representatives of NIH grantee institutions, asking them to review their records for evidence of malpractice, some involving foreign governments. Collins's initiative was not prompted by some big explosive episode, he told reporters from Science, but by a gathering sense that the time had come for action. In fact, the NIH had been tipped off by the FBI that one of its agents had identified a researcher at MD Anderson Cancer Center, that is part of the University of Texas research system, who was sharing NIH grant proposals that were supposed to be treated as confidential with several other people. The probe at MD Anderson began when the FBI notified the Cancer Research Center that it was investigating the possible theft of research and proprietary information by one of its researchers. A federal grand jury issued a subpoena in secret, authorizing the intelligence community's access to 5 years of emails by some of the center's employees, without any of them knowing a thing about it. In November 2017, the center's new president authorized the FBI to search the network accounts of 23 employees, I quote, for any purpose, at any time, for any length of time, and at any location. This was followed by FBI interviews with 4 Chinese Americans who worked at MD Anderson, asking whether they had had any professional links with China's Thousand Talents program. One of them claimed afterwards that, in fact, the FBI was essentially concerned about his loyalty. And I quote, they wanted to know, in effect, are you now, or have you ever been, more committed to curing cancer in China or in the United States? Precisely the concern, as you remember, raised by the American government in the McCarthy era of the early 1950s, about loyalty. It's about loyalty as much as about anything else. MD Anderson subsequently authorized the FBI to share any relevant information from its employees' accounts with the NIH or any other federal agency. This is the information that seems to provide the evidence that the NIH used in his letters to MD Anderson, identifying 5 researchers who were suspected of violating the NIH's rules. The compliance office at MD Anderson moved to terminate the contracts of 3 of the 5 of them, but 2 of them resigned before even the process was completed. One justification for granting the FBI access to the emails of NIH-funded researchers at MD Anderson was that sharing the results of fundamental research with a colleague in China was illegal and impugned US economic security. The connection was implicit in statements made by Lawrence Tabak, the principal deputy director of the NIH. Tabak described fundamental research, I'm getting a slide here, as pre-patented material. And so the antecedent to creating intellectual property, which in essence is stolen when someone takes his knowledge back to China. By thus characterizing even fundamental or basic biomedical research as pre-patented in a field earmarked as critical and emerging technology, the American administration opened a space for the state to level charges of IP theft against researchers who engaged in foreign collaborations or accepted some funding from foreign sources, no matter how innocuous this research may be. Since any kind of research in this field is apparently pre-patented. This practice was, of course, all the more reprehensible when the research at home was funded by the federal government. Seen through the eyes of the national security state, these researchers were sharing fundamental research funded by American taxpayers' dollars that was pregnant with commercial possibilities with a rival communist power. What might otherwise be regarded as constitutive of international collaboration escalated into potentially criminal behavior that would cost you your job if you did not get permission from the NIH to do so. Lieber didn't work at MD Anderson, but he received a lot of grant money from the NIH. And the risks of IP loss were palpable. He had been funded at Harvard by the DoD and the NIH, as I said, to the tune of $15 million. He had over 50 patents, and he had created 2 startups that exploited nanotechnology. All of this sensitive, unclassified knowledge and know-how would circulate between his lab in Harvard and his mirror lab in Wuhan. It is hardly surprising that the American government was watching him closely. But it's not just the federal government itself and federal government agencies that are clamping down on this kind of research. American universities themselves are stepping in to do the same. And MIT, we all know that, is a leader in this project, in this respect. A few years ago, MIT created a new procedure to evaluate grant proposals by its researchers who collaborated with China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. In those procedures, it imported the concerns of the national security state into its in-house vetting procedure that assessed the risks posed by any PI's proposal that was sought money from those sources. And the main target was China. And these risks, these procedures went like this. Here's a letter about 2018. Projects funded by people or entities from China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, etc. And I just jump a little bit. Special attention will be paid to risks related to intellectual property, export controls, data security and access, economic competitiveness, national security, and political, civil, and human rights, as well as etc., etc. So as you can see, this language, look at those, all these terms and all of these constraints, export controls, data security, economic competitiveness, national security, all come from the federal government's program of export controls and regulations, which have now been injected into the MIT grant evaluation system and are implemented even before the grant gets out the door. If a PI does not satisfy the MIT authorities that their grant application sufficiently avoids any kinds of risk of loss on any of these grounds, if they can't persuade the administration that there's no real danger in any of these areas, they may not actually go forward and submit their grant application. What's the sanction? The sanction is well known, and everybody at Georgia Tech has spoken to me about it. You will no longer get federal government funding if you actually do not respect these requirements. And since so many American universities require massively on huge inputs of federal grant funding, they are extremely careful to respect these kind of constraints on what they can share. Okay, so that's the core of my talk. I was going to say something about transnational history writing, but perhaps I should not. Let me just say that I'm studying a way of studying these kind of transnational exchanges, these kind of exchanges through a transnational lens that actually takes account of the fact that a great deal of knowledge does not flow freely across national borders, does not move freely as it wishes, as is explained or presumed or expected in the whole precept and ideology of scientific internationalism. I insist that indeed we need to get out of the way of thinking that explains the exchange of knowledge in fundamental basic research as driven by scientific internationalism in which national borders are irrelevant. That we need to break completely with that way of thinking and develop a way of thinking about knowledge exchanges which takes account of all these kinds of impediments to the flow of knowledge across borders, and unravel those and connect those impediments with a number of various considerations. I'll just read the text here because I've jumped way forward. By opening the black box of international collaboration, by identifying institutions and practices that facilitate the sharing of knowledge across borders, as well as those that restrict and regulate the transnational flow of knowledge across borders, we get a better understanding of the political economy of production and circulation of knowledge in a globalized world. So let me just wind up my last bit. Politics, economics, scientific and technological knowledge are all interwoven when we look at Lieber's behavior through this transnational lens. To think of him as simply sharing good science with his Chinese partners and to defend him in the name of scientific internationalism, as his Harvard colleagues are doing, is simply disingenuous. He's clearly one of many academics in the US research system who welcomed the opportunity to commercialize their research for personal gain, made possible by a swathe of legislation in the 1980s, including, of course, the famous Bayh-Dole Act. Sharing with China sensitive unclassified research, funded by American taxpayers' dollars, commercialized to improve the performance of electric batteries, necessarily exposes Lieber to charges of undermining American economic security. Lieber is not a victim of a particularly odious anti-science regime, although he's also that. He's run afoul of a national security state whose regulatory powers have been extended repeatedly since the beginning of the Cold War, and has now embraced fundamental research in certain domains with certain countries that is sensitive but not classified. The question is not whether or not the Biden regime will take a less confrontational approach to China to Lieber's advantage. The question rather is how he managed he could build with impunity a mirror lab in China producing commercializable, cutting-edge knowledge in an economically and militarily sensitive field like nanotechnology, no matter what kind of administration was in power. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And I think we can stop the recording here, if that's okay.